Joining me once again today is Christopher Petrella. He's a Ph.D. student in UC Berkeley's Department of African American Studies. His research focuses on race, class, and incarceration in the United States. He's taught a class at San Quentin State Prison, and prison policy is also an area of expertise. That's what we're here to talk about today. So, Christopher, great to have you as always. You have this new piece in the Journal of Radical Criminology called The Color of Corporate Corrections, Part 2. We've talked on this program with you and with others about private prisons. We've talked about the disproportionate incarceration of minorities, particularly for nonviolent crimes often connected to the war on drugs. What you're studying specifically here is specifically within private prisons, whether we see different rates of incarceration among minorities. Is it for specific crimes, or how did you look at it?
Right. Well, thanks for having me on, David. I appreciate it. One of the sort of chief purposes of my study was to think about what the demographic, particularly racial demographic of public versus private prisons is today. And unfortunately, there wasn't really that much data on this. So I went to state departments of corrections. I also went to private prison companies and requested basically as much data I could on racial composition of these private facilities. And what I ended up finding was that in the 9 states that I looked at, the 9 states that had the largest sample size, people of color were overrepresented in medium security, minimum and medium security private facilities relative to minimum and medium security public facilities. I didn't look at differential rates of crime. I also didn't necessarily look at the types of criminalization or the types of sentences. That was beyond the purview of the study.
Okay, so when we look at those numbers, then we have to ask ourselves, we've talked with you before about the interests that big corporations and big banks and investment houses have in a lot of these private prisons. We know the interest that private prisons have in extending or delaying the process of deportation of illegal immigrants so that way they can charge more days of detention for those who are awaiting trial.
That's right.
What do you see as the, how do you kind of tie it all together? Do you have ideas as to the reasoning that you speculate on? Have you done other research that might inform us on that?
Sure. Well, so the research endeavors to do a couple of things, right? So the first was I had a question about racial composition. That ultimately led me to questions of age and health. And what I found out was not only are these private prison companies differentially incarcerating communities of color relative to their public prison counterparts, but the age profile of the private prisons that I considered is far different than the public prisons that I considered. If the likelihood that you are a young person in a private prison is far greater than you being a young person in a public prison. Now, why is that? Written into private prison contracts between the state DOCs and also the federal government are particular provisions that exempt private prison companies from housing the most expensive types of individuals. And as you can imagine, who would those individuals be? Well, they would be older and or geriatric individuals. They would be individuals with a chronic illness. They would be non-compliant individuals. And so what I ended up finding was, I can provide a couple examples here. Arizona, for instance, the contracts I've seen between Arizona and Corrections Corporation of America are written in such a way that Corrections Corporation of America puts a $10,000 cap on health spending per year per prisoner. The minute you exceed that cap, if you're in the private prison, you get sent back to the public prison, right? I'll give you one other example. In Mississippi, MTC, which is Management and Training Corporation, it's the 3rd largest private prison company in the United States, does not cover mental health care, which we know is incredibly expensive, right? So the other thrust of the whole paper, of the whole argument, is that if you're not incarcerating the same profile of individuals, then it's virtually impossible to make a valid argument if you're a private prison company that you can do this more cheaply or more inexpensively than your public counterparts. So
Well,
in a
it's
lot of ways,
incredible because we have it's an amazing racket that they have going, because on the one hand, lots of these private corporations, when they strike deals with the states, they have occupancy requirements where the
that's
state
right.
is required to maintain, it could be 90, 95, 98% occupancy. And if they don't, they still have to pay as if that was the number of prisoners there. At the same time, you're giving examples of, if the prisoners you send us get too expensive, we send them back to you and you deal with the rest of the expense.
That is absolutely correct.
So when we look at this, we have to remember, I think it's important, what percentage of the country's prisoners are in private prisons? It's not that high, correct?
No, it's not that high. It's depending on how you classify private prisons, it's anywhere from about 9 to 12% of the entire carceral population.
Okay, so, and we are seeing some moves. I know Kentucky has eliminated all private prisons at this point, and a couple of other states have moved prisons from private to public. Are we seeing broadly a trend away from private incarceration?
Yeah, I think the public is a bit more suspicious these days. I'll put it that way. In the early 1980s, when a lot of these contract facilities were just getting off the ground, the public was a little, I'll say a little wary of what this would mean from a legal perspective, what this would mean from an ethical perspective, what this could mean from a fiscal perspective. And unfortunately, what happens is that inertia takes over, despite even the best intentions of those who may oppose these, privatization regimes. But I think we're starting to see the tides turn again, and a lot of folk, both progressives and conservatives, and this I think is particularly important for activism and organizing, are becoming much more suspicious, particularly those who once supported private prisons, namely conservatives.
Yeah, and it could be for different reasons, but
That's right.
coming to the same realization. Last thing, to take a step kind of back and look at things more broadly, when we talk about race and incarceration, I think it's always important for people to remember that much of the war on drugs, which has been one of the leading factors in the disproportionate incarceration of minorities in the United States, did stem as a sort of reaction to the desegregation and civil rights movement of the 1960s. So we have to remember that some of the kind of racially tinged effects of incarceration may have happened as a result of chance, but initially the war on drugs was in part a very racially tinged movement.
Yeah, that's right, David. I mean, to be perfectly honest with you, part of the calculus of my study relies heavily on a so-called drug war movement, because precisely the reason that the younger the prisoner you are, the higher likelihood that you're a person of color, and the older the prisoner you are, the higher likelihood that the census would classify you as non-Hispanic white, is precisely based on historical sentencing patterns that emanate from the so-called drug war. And just one final point here. Before the mid 1960s, ever since the 1920s, when the Bureau of Justice Statistics started keeping a lot of these aggregate pieces of data, 2/3 of the correctional population would be classified as non-Hispanic white. That's completely inverted today, right? About 1/3 are now classified as non-Hispanic white, and the remainder 2/3, up to even 70%, based on this, which studies you consider, are persons of color. And this, yes, is absolutely a result of the so-called war on drugs, which disproportionately criminalized communities of color and continues to do so.
We've been speaking with Christopher Petrella. The journal article is The Color of Corporate Corrections, Part 2. It's in the Journal of Radical Criminology. Great as always to have you on.
Thanks, David. I appreciate it.